So recording has begun. And it's time to share the screen. So today we're looking at deductive reasoning. Let me start by welcoming you to the second half of the semester. You remember on the very first day we had our class at the GCB hall, I was explaining that the first half of the semester was a preparation for the second. And during the first half of the semester, we were studying concepts in language and meaning. And we studied statements that are not logical. We also discussed how to identify passages that are argumentative or not. So now it is time to study arguments. But before I proceed, I would like to find out if I'm audible enough. So can you guys hear me? Can you hear what I'm saying?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, that's good.
Yes, sir.
So let's proceed. Different forms of reasoning. Now, arguments are also.
We can't see your screen.
Oh, you can't see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I thought I was sharing it. Now let me share again and see. So are you able to see my screen now?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So arguments are also called reasoning or syllogisms. The three terms are used interchangeably. So let me mute everyone. So we refer to arguments, reasoning, or syllogisms. Any of them may do in describing what we mean. That's the first thing. Then the second is that there are two major categories of reasoning. We have deductive and inductive. Two major categories, deductive and inductive. We also have causal reasoning, but that's a form of inductive reasoning. We shall come to that in 2 weeks' time. Let's begin with deductive reasoning. And this is the kind of reasoning we are going to discuss today. I would need you to pay very rapt attention because this is the most difficult kind of reasoning to teach. Some people teach this form of reasoning for 2 or 3 weeks, but I normally teach it in 1 week because I have devised ways of making students understand it quicker. So we also call it deductive argument or deductive syllogism. Now, this is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. The relationship between the premises and conclusion is a logical one. So as a result of this, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. So these are the things you should note. It's a logical relationship between the premises and conclusion, and that kind of reasoning permits only one conclusion. Example, all men are mortal. Kofi is a man, Kofi is mortal. So if you say that all men are mortal, and then you say that Kofi is a man, then it is just inevitable to conclude that Kofi is mortal. You cannot change or modify the conclusion. Example, Kofi is immortal, or a fire cabinet is mortal. Those things are not possible. Now, to begin this topic, we need to distinguish between what we call the reference and attribute classes. These are two parts of a sentence, like you have the subject and the predicate that you did in your secondary school. Now, the reference class is just like the subject that you know very well. And then the attribute class is just like the predicate you know well. For example, all men are mortal. All men is a reference class. That's also what we call the subject. And then are mortal is the attribute class, which is also what we call the predicate. So all men reference class, are mortal attribute class. Now the reference class is that to which the sentence refers. That's what we call it, the reference class. The sentence refers to that class, whilst the attribute class is that part of the sentence that is attributing something to, or saying something about the reference class. So to repeat that, the reference class is that to which the sentence refers, whilst the attribute class is that part of the sentence that is attributing something to or saying something about the reference class. Then another distinction is important. We have two kinds of reference classes. We have the finite and infinite reference classes. Now, the infinite reference class refers to all members or no members of a class, either 100% or 0%. Example, all men, no man, any man. These are infinite reference classes because you cannot count the items in the class. You can't count all men, you can't count no man, you can't count any man. They are uncountable. So we call them the infinite. We call these kinds of classes the infinite reference class. It's either referring to 100% of the members of a class or 0% of the members of a class. So counting doesn't come in. Then the finite reference class refers to countable and particular members of a class. Anything between 0 and 100%. Example, some men, 80% of men, 5 men, 1 man, all the men, few men, almost all the men. Now remember that all the men is different from all men. All men is uncountable, but all the men are countable. For instance, all the men in this class, all the men in this town, they are countable. So we have the finite and infinite reference classes. The finite reference class is a class that contains uncountable items, either 100 or 0%. And then the finite reference class contains countable or particular members, anything between 0% and 100%. Then we have the distinction between universal and particular statements. Statements containing the infinite reference class, all men, all boys, are called universal statements, whilst those containing finite reference class are called particular statements. Example of universal statements. All men are mortal is a universal statement. Example of particular statement, some men drink alcohol. 5 men were beaten to death. Those are particular statements. So let's exercise our brain before we begin to use these terms in our discussion of deductive reasoning. So first of all, which statements are universal and which are particular? This table is 3-legged. Is it a universal or particular statement? Bernard, your hand has been up. Do you want to answer?
Particular.
Particular. Good. Tables can be sat on. Universal or particular?
Universal.
Universal. James and Mary passed the examination.
Particular.
Particular.
All visitors should be treated with respect.
Universal.
Universal.
Universal. Okay. All right, so let's move on. Mute yourselves, mute yourselves, mute yourselves. Mute. Okay. Now let's look at validity, which is very important. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. An argument is valid if the premises make the conclusion necessary and the conclusion follows with certainty. All valid arguments are deductive arguments. So inductive arguments are strictly not valid. Only deductive arguments are capable of being valid. Any other argument that is not deductive argument is invalid. A purely mathematical argument, that's a deductive argument. So, deductive arguments are purely mathematical arguments. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is logical. So, refer back to the example of deductive argument. Let's go back. All men are mortal. Kofi is a man. Kofi is mortal. If you look at premises 1, 2, and conclusion, you will find that there are three concepts that are operational. The first concept is men. Men or man, that's a concept. Then the second concept is mortal. Mortal. And then the third one is Kofi. So we have three concepts. If you look at premise 1, men occurs once, mortal occurs once. Premise 2, Kofi occurs once, man occurs once. So that gives you what? It means that between premises 1 and 2, the concept of men or man occurred twice. Twice. And between premises 1 and 2, the concept of mortal occurred once. And if you look at premises 1 and 2, the concept Kofi occurred once. So you have two instances of men, one instance of mortal, one instance of Kofi. That tells you that the conclusion is going to be built with those concepts that have occurred only once. So for the argument to be complete with a conclusion, the concepts that occurred once have to come into the conclusion and arrange themselves there so that all the concepts will become 2, 2, 2. So you have all men are mortal, Kofi is a man. What it means is that you have to bring down Kofi and mortal to the conclusion and arrange them there. And because of the nature of the relationship between premise 1 and 2, all men are mortal, Kofi is a man, it means, it tells you that in the conclusion, Kofi is going to be the subject or the reference class. And then mortal is going to be saying something about Kofi. That makes it a purely mathematical argument. It's just an arrangement of concepts. The meaning of the concepts don't matter. What just matters is the mathematical relationship of the concepts. Whether it is men or trees or houses doesn't matter. Whether it is Kofi or Peter or Robert doesn't matter. So that's why we say that deductive arguments are purely mathematical arguments. They just work with, purely logical relationships. So let's go to where we are. And that is why we talked about validity. When the mathematics is correct, then we say the argument is valid. So validity means the mathematical correctness of the argument. And that is why we say that only deductive arguments are valid arguments. You will soon see additional reasons why. Now let's compare it to an inductive argument. Now this is an example of an inductive argument. Premise 1, 95% of men are honest. Premise 2, Peter is a man. Conclusion, Peter is honest. When you look at this argument, you find out that more than one conclusion is possible. Possible conclusion 1, Peter is honest. Possible conclusion 2, Peter is not honest. Why is that so? Because premise 1 refers to 95% of men. That means that there is another 5% that is not accounted for. So if you say that 95% of men are honest, and you say Peter is a man, Peter is honest, the argument gives you two conclusions. If Peter is among the 95%, then Peter is honest. If Peter is among the 5%, then Peter is not honest. Once an argument gives you more than one possible conclusion, then it is not a deductive argument. Automatically, it is an inductive argument. That is the simplest way of distinguishing between deductive and inductive arguments. When you look at an argument, ask yourself, does it give rise to one possible conclusion? Or is the conclusion more than one? That tells you whether it is deductive or inductive. Now let's go further. We'll look at the hidden condition if and then. There are two ways of looking at arguments. We can look at them as categorical statements or look at them as conditional statements. Now, all arguments have hidden conditionals. Now, look at the categorical statement. All men are mortal. Premise 1, all men are mortal. If you want to convert all men are mortal to a conditional statement, what you say is, if something is a man, then it is mortal. Categorical statement, all men are mortal. Conditional statement, if something is a man, then it is mortal. All you need to do is to bring in if and then. You look at the reference class or the subject, and then you just attach if to it. If something is a man. And then you look at the predicate or the attribute class, are mortal. If something is a man, then that thing must be mortal. So that's how to convert a categorical statement to a conditional statement. Now change the categorical statement of premise 1 to a conditional statement. If something is a man, so instead of saying premise 1, all men are mortal, I will say premise 1, if something is a man, then it is mortal. Then premise 2, Peter is a man. Conclusion, Peter is mortal. Now, one of the best ways of analyzing a deductive argument is to change premise 1 to a conditional statement. You are going to see a lot of that as we move on. Once you change premise 1 from a categorical statement to a conditional statement, then you see very clearly how premise 2 and the conclusion are moving from premise 1. So in this case, if something is a man, then it is mortal. Peter is a man. Therefore, Peter is mortal. So you see the argument more clearly compared to when premise 1 is a categorical statement. So we're going to be using conditionals a lot. I just want you to understand it very clearly. Now, another thing is that we're going to be working with symbols. We'll be replacing the concepts with symbols. Categorical version. All men are mortal. All A's are B's. I'm going to correct that to all from A. All men are mortal. All A's are B's. Peter is a man. X is an A. Peter is mortal. X is a B. So you just replace the concepts with symbols. The first concept is men. You replace men with A. And then the second concept is mortal. You replace mortal with B. And then the third concept is Peter. You replace Peter with X. All A's are B's. All men are mortal. All A's are B's. Peter is a man. X is an A. Peter is mortal. X is a B. When you replace these things with symbols, the symbols also help you to see how the argument is working. All A's are B's, X is an A, therefore X is a B. You can see how clear the argument is. If you say all A's are B's and if you say X is an A, you're obviously saying that X is a B. Look at the conditional version. Premise 1, if something is a man, then it is mortal. Premise 2, Peter is a man. Conclusion, Peter is mortal. If A, then B. X is an A, therefore X is a B. If A, then B. If A, then B. A, therefore B. So that's very clear. So that's a conditional version. Now let's look at another clarification, something we need to clarify well. Now you remember the attribute, the reference class and the attribute class. We said all men is reference class, our mortal is attribute class. So remember that, the difference between the reference class and the attribute class. If we restate any categorical proposition as a conditional statement, the reference class becomes the antecedent and the attribute class becomes the consequent. If we restate any categorical proposition as a conditional statement, the reference class becomes the antecedent and the attribute class becomes the consequent. In fact, whether we restated it as conditional or as categorical, whichever one it is, you know which one is the reference class and which one is the attribute class. And what we're saying is that the reference class becomes the antecedent. The consequent class is the consequent. Of course, you know what antecedent means. Antecedent means something that comes before. And naturally, when you look at a sentence, the reference class comes before the attribute class. So we call that the antecedent. And then the second class, which is the attribute class or the predicate, is a consequence. Naturally, that's natural. Okay. So example, or A are B, or if A then B. The reference class in this case is A. In this case, A is the antecedent. And then the attribute class, in this case, B, is the consequent. Or A are B. A is the reference class, we call it the antecedent. B is the attribute class or the predicate, we call it the consequent. So it's either you call A the subject, the reference class, the antecedent, and then you call B the predicate, which is in general English. In logic, we say it is the attribute class, and then for deductive arguments, we say it is the consequent. Now, the difference between subject and predicate is used in general English. The difference between reference class and attribute class is used in logic. But the difference between antecedent and consequent is used for only premise one. Not even all the premises, just premise one, or what we call the major premise. The major premise can be anywhere. It can be premise one, it can be premise two. You know, all men are mortal. You can take it to premise two, and then Peter is a man can come to premise one. You can arrange it in any way. So you have to, what matters is that all men are mortal. We call it the major premise. All men are mortal. So you need to learn to identify major premises. The minor premise just draws inferences from the major premise. So the major premise is normally divided into the antecedent and the consequent. And there's a reason why we do that. I will show you some. So A is the antecedent and B is the consequent. So any statement referring to A will be either affirming or denying the antecedent. And any statement referring to B will be either affirming and denying the consequent. Now, when you have identified the major premise, then you can see the antecedent and the consequent. The reference class is the antecedent and the attribute class is the consequent. That is for the major premise. The second premise, you will find out that the second premise is saying something about either the antecedent and the consequent. Let's go back to what we used to do. Now, look at this. All men are mortal. Peter is a man. Peter is mortal. Which is the major premise? The major premise is all men are mortal. Why is that the major premise? Because when you look at the other premise is saying something about either the antecedent or the consequent. That is why the other one is not the major premise. So the major premise is the one we divide into antecedent and consequent. And when you look at the other premise, you see that the other premise is saying something about either the antecedent or the consequent. So Peter is a man, is saying something about the antecedent. And then the conclusion is saying something about the consequent. Peter is mortal, is saying something about the consequent. So that is how to identify a major premise. It is only major premises that you categorize into antecedent and consequence, because the other statements in the argument are either saying something about the antecedent or saying something about the consequent. But the major premise is not saying something like that. It just contains, that is the statement that contains the antecedent and the consequent that the rest of the argument is referring to. So it is the major premise that we divide into antecedent and consequent. And you identify the major premise by realizing that all the other statements in the argument are either saying something about the antecedent of the major premise or the consequent of the major premise. In this example, you can see that premise 2 is saying something about men. Conclusion is saying something about mortal. So that tells you that premise 2 and conclusion, none of them is the major premise. The major premise has to be premise 1. In another example, they can mix it up. They can, Peter is a man can be premise 1, all men are mortal will be premise 2. But you still have to locate which one is the major premise. And I've just told you how to locate the major premise. You locate the major premise by singling it out, finding out that all the other statements in the argument are saying something about either the antecedent or the consequence of the major premise. Okay. So let's go to the last statement, or the second to the last. So we said all A are B. A is the antecedent and B is the consequent. Any statement referring to A will be either affirming or denying the antecedent, and any statement referring to B will be either affirming or denying the consequent. Example, X is an A, affirms the antecedent. X is not an A, denies the antecedent. X is a B, affirms the consequent. X is not a B, denies the consequent. So these are the 4 examples. Now let's look at the full argument. All A's are B's. X is an A, therefore X is a B. Now the major premise is premise 1. And then premise 2 is saying something about the antecedent of premise 1. And then the conclusion is saying something about the consequent of premise 1. So if you look at this argument, premises 1, 2, and conclusion, you see that premise 2 is affirming the antecedent. X is an A, is affirming the antecedent. When you see this kind of argument, you see that the whole argument is an argument that affirms the antecedent. It's not just premise 2 that is affirming the antecedent. We say it is the whole argument that is affirming the antecedent. It is an argument that affirms the antecedent. Now let's look at denying the antecedent. All A's are B's. X is not an A. So premise 2 is denying the antecedent. And then the conclusion says X is not a B. We say that this is an argument that denies the antecedent. It is an argument that denies. You don't just say that it is premise 2 that is denying the antecedent. You say the whole argument, or rather, this is an argument that denies the antecedent. You just identify that by looking at what the minor premise is doing. So this is an argument that denies the antecedent. Affirming the consequent. All A's are B's. X is a B. All A's are B's. X is a B. X is a B affirms the consequent. So we say that this is an argument that affirms the consequent. It is not just the minor premise that is doing it. It is the whole argument that is doing it. And then denying the consequent. All A's are B's. X is not a B. Therefore, X is not an A. X is not a B denies the consequence. So we say that this is an argument that denies the consequent. Okay. So we have seen like 4 examples. Affirming the antecedent, X is an A. Denying the antecedent, X is not an A. Affirming the consequent, X is a B. Denying the consequent, X is not a B. So we have seen 4 types of arguments. Affirming the antecedent, denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, denying the consequent. Okay. Just a minute. Okay. Now, having seen those 4 kinds of arguments, it is time to look at the rule for deductive reasoning. What is the rule for deductive reasoning? The rule for deductive reasoning is that we only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. So the only valid arguments are the ones that affirmed the antecedent and the one that denied the consequent. So if you go back, affirming the antecedent, what the rule is saying is that affirming the antecedent, this argument is valid. Denying the antecedent is not valid. Affirming the consequent is valid. Denying the consequent is not, affirming the consequent is not valid. Denying the consequent is valid. Look at the rule again. We only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. So out of the 4 arguments we have seen, only 2 of them are valid, and we're going to see why. Any other operation would make the argument lose its validity. So the other 2 arguments are invalid. They are invalid. So let's go back. Affirming the antecedent, X is an A. That's a valid argument. It will lead you to a valid conclusion. But X is not an A will not lead you to a valid conclusion. Affirming the consequent, X is a B will not lead you to a valid conclusion. But denying the consequent, X is not a B, will lead you to a valid conclusion. Now we're going to see why it works like that. Example, all A's are B's. X is an A, affirms the antecedent. X is a B, valid argument. So affirming the antecedent is valid, like we said. Now we're going to convert the argument into words so that we'll find out why it is like that. All A's are B's. X is not an A, denies the antecedent. X is not a B, not valid. So this one denies the antecedent. It is not valid. The first one is valid. The second one is not valid. Let's convert to words. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian. Therefore, Peter is an African. So we said this is a valid argument. If you say that all Ghanaians are Africans, and you also say that Peter is a Ghanaian, which affirms the antecedent, Ghanaians, then Peter is an African is a valid conclusion. Look at it very carefully. If all Ghanaians are Africans and Peter is a Ghanaian, then it means that Peter is an African. Now let's look at the second one and see why it is not valid. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian. Therefore, Peter is not an African. We said this one is not valid. Now, if you say all Ghanaians are Africans, and you say Peter is not a Ghanaian, and then you conclude that because Peter is not a Ghanaian, Peter is not an African, the question is whether it is valid. We said it's not valid. Why is it not valid? If all Ghanaians are African, and you say Peter is not a Ghanaian, you have not successfully denied Peter of being an African. The fact that Peter is not a Ghanaian does not deny him of being an African. He could be from some other African country. And we're going to see why. Now, the reason is that the consequent is always a larger class of denotations or members compared to the antecedent. The consequent contains the denotations of both the antecedent and possibly more. The consequent Africans contains more members compared to the antecedent Ghanaians. So consequents are always larger classes than antecedents. In this case, the consequent African contains more members than the antecedent Ghanaians. When you deny something of membership in a smaller class, you have not denied it of membership in a larger class. But when you deny something of membership in a larger class containing all the members of a smaller class, you have automatically denied it of membership in a smaller class. So let's look at it once again. All Ghanaians are Africans. Africans is a larger class than Ghanaians. Now, Africans contain all Ghanaians. If Peter is a Ghanaian, automatically he's an African. But saying that Peter is a Ghanaian does not automatically mean he's not an African, because there are other nationalities in Africa. So that's why we said when you deny something of membership in a smaller class, you have not automatically denied it of membership in a larger class. But when you deny something of membership in a larger class containing all the members of a smaller class, you have automatically denied it of membership in a smaller class. Now, I'm going to show you diagrams that demonstrate it very well so that you will understand it very easily. But before then, let's look at the 4 kinds of deductive arguments, which we've already seen, but now we're going to attach those arguments with names. First of all, you have modus ponens. This is an argument that affirms the antecedent. So any argument that affirms the antecedent is a modus ponens. All A's are B's. X is an A, therefore X is a B. It's an argument that affirms the antecedent. We call it modus ponens. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is a Ghanaian. Therefore Peter is an African. An argument that affirms the antecedent. We say it is a modus ponens. Then we have fallacy of modus ponens, a fallacy of denying the antecedent. So when you say all A's are B's, X is not an A, therefore X is not a B. This is an argument that denies the antecedent. We call it a fallacy of denying the antecedent. All Ghanaians are Africans. Peter is not a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is not an African. It's a fallacy. It's not a valid argument. Peter could possibly be a Cameroonian. Now let's look at the sizes of antecedent and consequent. We said consequents are larger classes compared to antecedents. So look at the box. The consequent box is very large, and then the antecedent box is somewhere within the consequent box. You can see that everything in the antecedent is automatically in the consequent. So if you say that something is a member of the antecedent, automatically it's a member of the consequent. That's why we say that affirming the antecedent will automatically affirm the consequent. But if you say something is not in the antecedent, you have not automatically denied it of membership in the consequent, because it could be in any other part of the consequent box apart from the antecedent box. So denying something of membership in the consequent does not automatically deny it of membership in the consequent. That's why we say that denying the antecedent in order to reach a conclusion is not a valid argument. Now look at these boxes. The African box is larger than the Ghanaian box. If you say Peter is a Ghanaian, then automatically he's an African. But if you say Peter is not a Ghanaian, you have not proved that he's not an African. So saying that Peter is not a Ghanaian does not automatically lead you to the conclusion he's not an African. So affirming the antecedent is valid. It will lead you to a valid conclusion. But denying the antecedent will not lead you to a valid conclusion. And the other way around, affirming that something is an African, someone is an African, does not automatically mean he's a Ghanaian. If you say someone is an African, then he could be any other nationality. Saying someone is an African as a way of showing that he's a Ghanaian is not valid. You cannot say Peter is a Ghanaian because Peter is an African. Or you cannot say Peter is an African, therefore Peter is a Ghanaian. No, that argument will not be valid. But you can say Peter is a Ghanaian, therefore Peter is an African. You see that? That's why we say you can only affirm the antecedent to reach a valid conclusion. You cannot affirm the consequent to reach a valid conclusion. But you can deny the consequent to reach a valid conclusion. If you say Peter is not an African, then automatically he's not a Ghanaian. So you can deny the consequent to reach a valid conclusion. But you cannot affirm the consequent to reach a valid conclusion. Then you can affirm the antecedent to reach a valid conclusion, but you cannot deny the consequent to reach a valid conclusion. Modus tollens, an argument that denies the consequent. All A's are B's. X is not a B, therefore X is not an A. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. So an argument that denies the consequent is a valid argument. In 2 words, all Ghanaians are Africans. Michael is not an African, therefore Michael is not a Ghanaian. So we say this argument is valid because it denies the consequent. Once you establish that Michael is not an African, then automatically he cannot be a Ghanaian. All you need to know, all you need to prove that Michael is not a Ghanaian is to prove, first of all, that he's not an African. Because every single Ghanaian is an African. The African class is larger than the Ghanaian class. So just deny him of membership in the African class, and automatically it means he's not in the smaller class. So that's why we say that arguments that deny the consequent are valid. Look at this other example. All those studying in the Department of Physics are enrolled at the University of Ghana. Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana, so Kevin is not studying in the Department of Physics. Now, just imagine that some people are debating whether Kevin is in physics or not. Some people are saying Kevin is in physics. Some people are saying, no, Kevin is not in physics. And then the controversy becomes so much. People don't know whether Kevin is in physics or not. And then someone goes to the registry to go and ask the registrar, please, we want to know whether Kevin is in the University of Ghana. And then the registrar makes investigations and then announces that Kevin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana. What does that do to the debate about whether Kevin is in the Department of Physics or not? Automatically, it means he's not in the Department of Physics. Because the Department of Physics is in the University of Ghana. Anyone in the Department of Physics must be in the University of Ghana. So if you denied him of membership in the University of Ghana, automatically you've denied him of membership in the Department of Physics. So that's why we say that modus tollens is a valid argument. Modus tollens, any argument that denies a consequent will lead you to a valid conclusion. Remember where we started. We said the rules for deductive reasoning. Let's look at that rule again. The rule for deductive reasoning. We only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. Any other operation will make the argument lose its validity. Okay. Now, so these are the boxes University of Ghana is a bigger box. Department of Physics is a smaller box. If Kelvin is not enrolled at the University of Ghana, then automatically he cannot be at the Department of Physics. Then we have the fallacy of modus tollens, the fallacy of affirming the consequent. If you affirm the consequent, it will not lead to a valid conclusion. The conclusion will be invalid. All A are B, X is a B, therefore X is an A. The argument is invalid. Let's convert it into words. All Ghanaians are Africans. George is an African, therefore George is a Ghanaian. The argument is invalid. It can't be valid. The fact that George is an African does not establish that George is a Ghanaian. The consequent Africans contains a logically larger category of denotations compared to the antecedent Ghanaians. So the fact that George is an African does not necessarily mean that he's a Ghanaian. He may be a South African or a Cameroonian. If we affirm the consequent, we're not sure we can affirm the antecedent. In short, if we affirm the consequent, it will land us in the same kind of uncertainty that we saw in the fallacy of modus ponens. Now let's look at another form of the fallacy of modus tollens. All A are not B. X is not a B, therefore X is an A. All A are not B. X is not a B, therefore X is an A. Now, if you look at premises 1 and 2, they both contain not B's. Premise 1 contains not B. Premise 2 contains not a B. So the two premises are negative. Now we know that in mathematics, if you combine two negatives, you get a positive. So it is just like saying all A are B, X is a B. So this is actually an argument that affirms the consequent. It is an argument that affirms the consequent. Two negatives gives you a positive. Now let's convert it to words. All human beings are not goods. X is not a good. Therefore, X is a human being. So this is an argument that affirms the consequent. If you convert it to conditional, if you're a human being, then you're not a good. You are not a good. Therefore, you're a human being. Now, why is it a fallacy? Why is the argument not valid? Not being a goat is a logically larger category than all human beings. So when you say all human beings are not goats is larger than all human beings. The things that are not goats in the universe are much more than human beings. There are so many other entities in the universe apart from human beings that are not goats. So the consequent not goats, let's go back there. All human beings are not goats. The consequent not goats is larger than human beings because not goats contains other animals. It contains dogs, crocodiles, it contains chicken, it contains whatever, birds, snakes, all those things are not goats. So not goats is a larger class compared to human beings. So when you say X is also not a goat, does that automatically show that X is a human being? Remember that this is an argument that affirms the consequent. And we said affirming the consequent cannot automatically affirm the antecedent. So you have not goats in premise 1 and you have not a goat in premise 2. So that is affirming the consequent, and that's invalid. Not being a goat is a logically larger category than all human beings. So the fact that X is not a goat does not necessarily mean X is a human being. X could as well be a cat, giraffe, or a tiger. So that is the end of modus ponens and modus tollens and their corresponding fallacies. Now let's look at the third kind of deductive argument. Now, We call it the hypothetical syllogism. Hypothetical syllogism is an argument where the consequence of an initial or first premise becomes the antecedent of a second or subsequent premise, and subsequent premises feature the consequences of their predecessors as the antecedent. So the conclusion pairs the very first antecedent with the very last consequent. Now we're saying that the consequent of a premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise, and it just continues like that. Let's look at it. All A are B, all B are C. Therefore, all A are C. So the conclusion just brings together the very first antecedent and the very last consequent. So we have all A are B, all B are C. Bring the antecedent of the first one and bring the consequent of the second one, and both of them will form the conclusion. Therefore, all A are C. You can extend it from C down to Z. You can say all A are B, all B are C, all C are D, all D are E, all E are F, all F are G, all G are H, and so on, all Y are Z. And then the conclusion will be therefore all A are Z. So that's a hypothetical syllogism. The consequent of a particular premise becomes the antecedent of the next premise, and it continues like that for the number of premises you have. Let's translate it to words. All Ghanaians are Africans. All Africans are human beings. Therefore, all Ghanaians are human beings. You can also extend the premises further. You can say all Ghanaians are Africans. All Africans are human beings. All human beings are animals. All animals are living things. All living things will go to heaven. Therefore, all Ghanaians will go to heaven. Let's look at the conditional. If you're a Ghanaian, then you're an African. If you're an African, then you're a human being. Therefore, if you're a Ghanaian, then you're a human being. Or you can say if you're a Ghanaian, then you're an African. If you're an African, then you're a human being. If you're a human being, then you're an animal. If you're an animal, then you're a living thing. If you're a living thing, then you go to heaven. Therefore, if you're a Ghanaian, then you go to heaven. That's a hypothetical syllogism. We call it a hypothetical syllogism. We notice that the consequence of the first premise, which is B, all A are B, becomes the antecedent of the second premise. And then the antecedent of the second premise, which is the consequence of the first premise, leads us to a new party, which is C, as a consequence. So any additional subsequent premise will typically feature the consequence of its predecessor as its antecedent, so that it is linked conditionally to a fresh party. So that's how it works. Now we have two fallacies of hypothetical syllogism. The first fallacy, let's look at it. The first fallacy is all A are B, all B are C, therefore all C are A. So in this case, you are reversing the terms in the conclusion. Instead of bringing together the first antecedent and the last consequent, you are bringing both of them together, but you are putting the last consequent ahead of the first antecedent, which is wrong. Let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Africans are human beings, therefore all human beings are Ghanaians. So you see it doesn't work. So that's the first hypothetical fallacy. Then let's look at the second hypothetical fallacy. All A are C, all B are C. Therefore all A are B. Look at it carefully. It doesn't follow the normal pattern. Now, this is not all A are B. It just went straight to all A are C. And then the second one says all B are C. So both of them are referring to C. All A are C, all B are C. Therefore, all A are B. So this is wrong. It will not lead you to a valid conclusion. Let's put it in words. All Ghanaians are Africans, all Kenyans are Africans. Therefore, all Ghanaians are Kenyans. So you see, it doesn't work. If you are a Ghanaian, then you are an African. If you are a Kenyan, then you're an African. Therefore, if you are a Ghanaian, then you're a Kenyan. So it's a fallacy. That's the second hypothetical fallacy. It can be true by accident. For instance, depending on the concepts we are using. All Ghanaians are human beings. all Africans are human beings, therefore all Ghanaians are Africans. Well, this one is true, but it is true by accident. True by accident. You should be able to tell when something is true by accident. And the fact that it is true by accident doesn't mean it is a valid hypothetical syllogism. It's still a fallacy, although it is true by accident. Now, this is the fourth and the last deductive argument. So we have treated modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, and now the last one is disjunctive syllogism. Disjunctive syllogism is a syllogism where the main premise is a disjunctive, either or. When we affirm something of any of the disjunctive items, then we have automatically denied it the other disjunctive part. So when you make a statement that something is either this or that, if you say it is this one, then automatically you say it is not the other one. If you say it is the other one, then automatically you say it is not this one. Example, either A is true or B is true. A is true, so B is false. Or either A is true or B is true. B is true, so A is false. Let's put it in words. Either I became a reverend father or I got married. I got married, so I did not become a reverend father. Or either I became a reverend father or I got married. I became a reverend father, so I did not get married. So this is a disjunctive syllogism. The main premise is a disjunctive statement. And every other statement in the argument is making use of the disjunctive statement or is working with the disjunctive statement. So you can easily identify the main premise in this argument. The main premise is the either or premise. A little exercise. Determine what kind of argument this is. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Today he passed by my mother's house, so he went to town. What kind of argument is this? Is this a modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, or disjunctive syllogism? Anyone can help. To sort it out, you probably need to convert the concepts into symbols and then work with the symbols and see what kind of argument it is. Yeah, Irene Saki, do you want to answer that? Who wants to answer it? Samuel. Did Samuel raise his hand? Let's look at the argument again. Anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. So anytime he goes to town is the antecedent. He passes by my mother's house is a consequence. Today he passed by my mother's house. So what does the second premise do? Does it affirm or deny the antecedent, or does it affirm or deny the consequence? So is it an argument that affirms or denies the antecedent, or affirms or denies the consequence? And that automatically tells you the answer.
It affirms the antecedent.
It affirms the consequence. So if it affirms the consequence, is it valid or invalid?
It's valid. Valid.
Valid?
So it's invalid.
Invalid. And by the way, what do you call an argument that affirms the consequence?
Fallacy of modern modus tollens.
Repeat that. The fallacy of what? Modus what?
Tollens.
You mean the ponens with the P or the tollens with the T?
The tollens with T.
the tolerance with T. Okay. So this is a fallacy of modus tollens because it affirms the consequent. And we say that if you affirm the consequent, then it will land you in an invalid conclusion. So based on the rule of deductive reasoning, we already know that this argument is invalid. But to understand why it is invalid, let's look at the argument very well and try to understand with our common sense why it is invalid. So based on your common sense, can you tell us why this argument is invalid?
Say, please can I answer?
Go ahead.
They said anytime he goes to town, he passes by my mother's house. Today he passed by my mother's house, so he went to town. It could be that he went somewhere else and had to pass by your mother's house to his place. So that doesn't necessarily mean that he went to town.
Yeah, yes. So that's a fair attempt. Now he passes by my mother's house in order to go to town. But remember that the town is not the only place he can go when he passes by my mother's house. He can pass by my mother's house to go to the next house. Probably he's going to see his girlfriend at the next house. So passing by my mother's house doesn't necessarily mean he has gone to town. If someone has to pass by your house in order to go to 37, if someone needs to pass your house to go to 37, and today you see him passing by your house, can you swear that he's going to 37? Of course,
No.
you can't. Yeah, so that's why the argument is invalid. So affirming the consequent would always give you an invalid conclusion. So the best thing you can do is to work with the rules for deductive reasoning. You can only affirm an antecedent or deny a consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. If you deny an antecedent, it will be invalid. If you affirm the consequent, it will be invalid. Answer correctly. We deduce correctly when we deny the antecedent. True or false?
That is true.
No. No, it's false.
It's
Okay, come again. We deduce correctly when we deny the antecedent. If we deny the antecedent,
It's false.
true.
okay, so it's false.
Yeah.
Number two, we deduce correctly when we affirm the antecedent.
True.
And then number three, we deduce correctly when we deny the consequent.
True.
True.
And then number four, we deduce correctly when we affirm the consequent.
False.
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 All right, so that wraps it up. Now let's look at validity versus soundness. So we saw the four types of deductive syllogism: modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, and disjunctive syllogism. Now the four types of deductive syllogism are four ways of making deductively valid arguments. A valid argument is an argument whose premises are logically consistent with its conclusion. The premises of a valid argument necessarily imply its conclusion in the manner that it is impossible to deny the inference without running into self-contradiction. So a deductive argument gives you only one conclusion, and you cannot deny the conclusion without running yourself into self-contradiction. That's how you know that an argument is valid. On the other hand, an invalid argument is an argument whose premises do not logically imply the conclusion. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not that of logical necessity. You can proceed to deny the conclusion of an invalid argument without contradicting yourself. For instance, we saw an example of an inductive argument. 95% of men are honest. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is honest. In that one, it's an invalid argument. You can deny the conclusion without contradicting yourself. You can say Peter is not honest, and you have not contradicted yourself. Yeah. So the formal fallacies are the invalid arguments. The invalid arguments are in deductive reasoning. We call them the formal fallacies. So denying the antecedent is a formal fallacy. Affirming the consequent is a formal fallacy. And then the two types of hypothetical fallacies are formal fallacies. So all the fallacies we saw in the topic of deductive reasoning, we call them formal fallacies. Because in the next 3 weeks or so, we're going to be looking at informal fallacies. So it is important you know that the fallacies we treated today are called formal fallacies. Valid but not sound. Now, an argument can be valid but not sound. Because an argument can be valid, but it is not saying the truth. Example, premise 1, all human beings are immortal. Peter is a human being, therefore Peter is immortal. Now, this argument is valid because it follows the rules of correct deductive reasoning.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, who's there?
Please, I can't see your screen. It's still on validity versus soundness.
Okay, so can you see it now?
No, please.
Can anyone see the screen? Can anyone else see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, please, we can see
Yes,
it.
Okay.
So please, she should try to pin
Sir,
you
please go
on
share.
the screen.
Go.
Okay, so if anyone cannot see the screen, then
Sir,
The line is also
please can you
breaking.
go over the valid argument?
yeah, so please mute yourselves. And anyone who cannot see the screen can be patient. You watch the video later because others can see it. So I think the problem is from your device. Okay, so let's go back to validity versus soundness. So we say that a valid argument is an argument that follows the correct rules for deductive reasoning. Any argument that follows the correct rules for deductive reasoning is valid. But being valid does not mean it is sound, because being valid does not mean it is saying the truth. For example, if you say all human beings are immortal, Peter is a human being, therefore Peter is immortal, it is valid because it follows the rules for corrective deductive reasoning. It affirms the antecedent, so it is correct. It is valid, but it is not saying the truth. And why is it not saying the truth? It is not saying the truth because there is a falsehood in premise 1. All human beings are immortal is false. So there's a falsehood there, and that falsehood enters the conclusion. So this argument is valid, but it is not sound because it is not true. Validity without truthfulness is not sound. Valid because correct modus ponens, but it is not sound because one of the premises is not true. So it is important for you to know that there are arguments that are valid but not sound because those arguments are not true. Validity doesn't mean that it is true. Other examples, all men are mammals. All mammals must get killed. Therefore, all men must get killed. Is it true? It's not true. Where is the problem coming from? The problem is coming from premise 2. All members must get killed is not correct. So once there's a falsehood in any of the premises, it will corrupt the whole argument. And the argument, even if the argument is valid, you cannot say it is sound because it is not true. Sometimes you can have an invalid argument with a true conclusion. Let's look at this argument. It is invalid, but the conclusion is true. Democracy is better than other forms of political organization because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in another form of political organization. So where is the conclusion and where is the premise? Remember that an argument can have only one premise. Okay, so the conclusion is democracy is better than other forms of organization. And then the premise is because citizens in a democracy are holier than citizens in another form of politics. So if you want to arrange it properly, you say citizens in a democracy are holier compared to citizens in other political organizations. Therefore, democracy is better than other forms of organization. So the conclusion is true. We all accept that democracy is better than other forms of political argument. But is it because the premise is correct? Is it because citizens in democracy are holier? So you can have an invalid argument with a true conclusion. The truthfulness of the conclusion does not necessarily mean that an argument is valid. So there are two things. First of all, the fact that an argument is valid doesn't mean the argument is true. And now we're also seeing that the fact that the conclusion of an argument is true does not mean the argument itself is valid. So validity doesn't always mean truthfulness or soundness. And then truthfulness of conclusion doesn't always mean validity. It goes both ways, and you need to be careful and vigilant. So true conclusion alone does not make an invalid argument correct. Then we are valid and sound. To be sound, all the premises in a valid argument must be true. So for you to have both validity and soundness, all the premises must be true. All men are mortal. Peter is a man, therefore Peter is mortal. So this argument is valid and also sound. So we have three forms. We have valid and sound, valid and unsound, and then we have invalid and unsound. Valid and sound, all snakes are reptiles. Cobra is a snake, which is true. Therefore, cobra is a reptile, which is true. All snakes are reptiles, is true. Cobra is a snake, is true. Therefore, cobra is a reptile, is true. So it is valid because it follows the correct rule for deductive reasoning, which is affirming the antecedent. And it is also true because all the premises are true. Then we have valid but unsound. All snakes are reptiles. That is true. Mosquitoes are snakes. That is false. Therefore, mosquitoes are reptiles. False. It is valid because it follows the correct rule of deductive reasoning, which is affirming the antecedent. But it is unsound because one of the premises is not true. Then we have both invalid and unsound, which is a sort of double jeopardy. All snakes are reptiles. That is true. Mosquitoes are reptiles. That is false. Therefore, mosquitoes are snakes. False. So it is invalid because the argument affirms the consequence. It is unsound because one of the premises is not true. Is an invalid but sound argument possible? No. An invalid argument is unsound, even if the premises and conclusion are all true. All Ghanaians are Africans. Kofi is an African, therefore Kofi is a Ghanaian. So the argument is invalid. But in reality, it could be true. Kofi could be a Ghanaian. But you cannot get that truthfulness from this argument. This argument cannot produce the conclusion that Kofi is a Ghanaian. If you want to know whether Kofi is a Ghanaian, you cannot know that with this particular argument. I hope you understand that. For you to know whether Kofi is a Ghanaian, you have to leave these arguments and go elsewhere. This argument cannot give you that information. So in spite of the fact that this argument might be true by accident, it is invalid. So as far as it is invalid, it is not sound. Validity is needed for soundness, but soundness is not needed for validity. Something can be valid and it is not sound. Some arguments are valid but not true. We have seen that. Soundness needs both validity and truth. Let's exercise ourselves. Identify the missing premise in each of the following deductive arguments. All military men play football. Bob plays football. There needs to be a third statement that is missing. All military men play football. Bob plays football. What is the missing premise?
Bob is a military man.
Bob is a military man.
Bob is a military man. That's the missing premise. Let's look at the second one. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals. All Americans are human beings. All Americans are mammals.
So all human beings are mammals.
Human beings are mammals.
All human beings are mammals. That's correct. All right. Okay, so answer correctly. Which fallacy is committed by the following? All A's are C's, all B's are C's, all A's are B's.
Hypothetical syllogism.
It's rather a hypothetical fallacy. If you say it's a hypothetical syllogism, you have not identified it as a hypothetical fallacy.
Yes,
All right. Describe the following arguments. All Europeans are not my friends. Ben is not a European. Ben is my friend. What kind of argument? Is it modus ponens, modus tollens, or is it a fallacy of modus ponens, or fallacy of modus ponens, or tollens, or what is it? All Europeans are not my friends. Ben is not a European. Ben is my friend.
The fallacy of modus ponens.
Look at the second one. The second one is a clearer way of saying the first one. So if you look at the second one, you see the first one more clearly. No European is my friend. Ben is not a European. Ben is my friend.
Fallacy of modus ponens.
Fallacy of modus ponens. Are you saying it denies the antecedent? Now remember that two negatives will give you a positive. Two negatives will give you a positive. So it is just like saying Europeans are my friend. Ben. It's just like saying Europeans are my friends. Ben is a European.
Fallacy of modus.
It's a modus ponens.
Yeah, so if you look at the no European in the first premise, and then you look at Ben is not a European in the second premise, no European and not a European will give you simply European. So it affirms the antecedent. Remember that it is purely mathematics. So you just do the math, you know. All right. So it affirms. It's a positive. Or you say it's an affirmation. Okay, so that's the end of the class. We'll be doing inductive reasoning next week. And at this point, anyone who has questions can ask before we round up. and then I'm going to upload this recording to your Sakai and then send it to someone to send it to your WhatsApp platforms.
Sir, please, when I'm writing the IE,
I'm not in charge of assessments. So the assessments, I don't know when they are being set. They are being set by the coordinator. So anything about the assessments, just ask the coordinator because she is giving you all the assessments. You know, we are all teaching the same thing. So she knows exactly what I'm teaching you, and she's giving you questions based on that.
sir, what will be the mode?
I don't know. That one is up to her. She might decide to make it multiple choice or in essay form or a combination of both.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so any other question? Fidel, do you have something to ask?
Yes, Doc, please, will we write the IA online or how
I suspect it to be I suspect it to be. I think she talked about making it in person, you know, but I don't know. The final decision is up to her. She can make both the IA and the exam in person, in which case you will go to the UGCS and take it at their computers, or she can make the IA online and the exam in person. You make yourself available to any of the options.
Sorry, we want off-site, online off-site, so we can relax. Charlie, the learning is not easy.
Let's hope she. But at the same time, online offsite can permit some malpractices. Last session, someone was taking people's password and writing the assessments for them offsite, online or offsite. So it triggered the decision to be conducting some of your assessments in person. You know, so everything depends on her. Any other questions?
Sir, please, where can we find you?
Come again.
Where can we find you?
Well, if you want to see me, just call me. I hardly come to the office, you know. Since the COVID-19, interpersonal activities, especially the physical aspects, have been largely reduced.
We don't have his number too, so in case of anything, how can we reach him?
Yeah, get my number from the course outline. Once you have the course outline, you see my number beside my name, I think. If it is not there, you can get it from any of your reps. Get it from Gifty or from Israel or from Hayford.
Thank you, sir.
All right, you're welcome. So at this point, I'm going to end the recording so that it will save up, and then I'll transfer it to your Sakai platform, and then someone is going to send it to your WhatsApp platforms so that you can immediately begin to watch the lesson. I know this is the most difficult topic of the semester, so probably you'll need to watch the video several times. So someone else is raising his hand. Irene, do you have a question to ask?
Please, I'm not on the WhatsApp platform.
Yeah, please get in touch with your TA, your tutor, Isaac, or with any of your course reps. Get in touch with Gifty or you can send me a message, get my number, send me a message, and then I'll direct you to any of them, and then they will put you there.
Okay, please.
You're welcome.